You're looking at the most expensive production car built in the United States in 1956, the Continental Mark II. But if it cost so much, why did it lose money? Hi there, Rick DeBrule with another chapter in the automotive evolution here once again at the Martin Auto Museum in Phoenix. You know, this is a great collection with more than 180 cars, and it's constantly growing and changing. And the latest edition, well, it's this 1956 Continental Mark II. And don't call this a Lincoln Continental. For 1956, Continental had become its own division within Ford, separate from Lincoln. And that division had just one job: to build the most expensive American car for 1956, the Continental Mark II. It cost nearly $10,000. And even at that price, it was still losing money. But before I dive into the story of this spectacular automobile, please take a moment to like and subscribe. The likes really are very important to me. And in the comments below, I want to know what I got right and, of course, what I got wrong. There's always something I get wrong. And also, tell me your Continental stories. Was your family lucky enough, and probably wealthy enough, to own one of these? Or did they have a later model Continental? All right, back to our Continental Mark II. And we have to start our story about this car by going back to the late 30s. Well, that's when Ford developed the first generation Lincoln Continental. Now, as the legend goes, it was originally designed as a personal vehicle for company president Edsel Ford. Essentially, it was a modified Lincoln Zephyr. Edsel and his friends apparently liked it so much that it was almost immediately put into production. Early models were built with that V12 engine, and they were produced in relatively small numbers with a very high degree of hand finishing. Production, of course, stopped with World War II, and then it picked up again in 1946. When the post-war Lincolns were finally introduced in 1949, Ford wasn't ready to create the upscale Continental version that deserved the name. As a result, there were no Continentals built between 1949 and 1955. But when the Continental returned, it arrived in style. Ford wanted to show that it was more than just your standard car company, that it could also build the world's finest luxury automobiles. And to achieve that goal, it created a new Continental division overseen by William Clay Ford Sr. To build the best, they turned away from the high-speed production lines, and they built the Mark II in a controlled environment where much of the crafting was done by hand. Each car had several coats of paint that were sanded and polished between each stage. Inside, only the finest leather was used. The result, well, it was a car that had a huge price tag, $9,966, the most expensive production car in America that year. And despite that, or maybe because of it, the Mark II attracted attention from a lot of well-known buyers. Elvis Presley owned a Continental Mark II, as did Elizabeth Taylor and Frank Sinatra. Ownership of a Mark II signaled access to a product that was not widely seen just about anywhere. In fact, there's a famous story where Elvis got into a fight with a service station owner who demanded that Elvis leave with his Continental after too many of his fans showed up. All right, let's walk around and take a look at the styling in our Continental Mark II. Remember, don't call this a Lincoln. It is purely a Continental out of the Continental division. And when they were designing this, they wanted something that was intentionally different. Kind of remember, everything during the mid-50s was space age or jet age. When they were designing this, they wanted something they called modern formal. Now, it was done under the guidance of a gentleman by the name of William Clay Ford Sr., but the actual design credit goes to two guys, Frank Hershey and Gordon Burig. They're the ones who decided to come up with this elegant styling, and they did a great job. But there are some significant differences between this, for example, and a Lincoln from 1956. The Lincoln would have had headlights that kind of canted forward, kind of a speedy kind of look. If you look here on the Continental, pretty much almost straight up and down. And the grille was another significant difference. If you look at a Premier or a Capri Lincoln from 1956, it's a much lower inlet style at the very bottom. This is much bolder, much taller. And when you look down the side of this car, that's when you see something that is completely different than the Lincolns, even the Fords, or just about any car that was coming out in the mid-1950s that had any luxury or any style. That's because there's no chrome on the side of this, or should I say very little chrome. You see some down here at the very bottom, but along the side, look at that railing going all the way back. Just the chrome handles, but no chrome accents, which is very unusual. The roof design too was also very different. Remember, this is designed to be a formal roof line. If you look at the roof lines of Fords or of the Lincolns, they have more of a slope to them right here. This is more upright. There is no B-pillar here, of course, because that was designed to give it a more stylish look. Going to the back, interestingly enough, they have an homage to the Continental tire, but they don't actually have a Continental tire in the back. A Continental tire is just a tire that's mounted on the outside. You see those a lot of times. Well, the 1956 Thunderbird is a classic example of this. But in this case, what they've done is they've moved it inside, but left the design, the outline of the Continental tire on the outside. So pretty interesting. This has a wheelbase of 126 inches, which is actually the same as the Lincolns for that year. But interestingly, this car is actually 4 inches shorter than a Lincoln Premier or a Lincoln Capri. I love this big wraparound windshield, the way it goes around here, great look. But this windshield also is actually, I believe, about 8 inches back further than it would be if you were looking at it on a Lincoln Premier or a Capri. One of the great things about 1956 is there was a complete redesign of the Lincoln cars, new chassis, new bodies. And this car is essentially built on a Lincoln Premier chassis. And one of the great things about it is it has what they call a step-down chassis, meaning that the body itself is mounted just a little bit lower. As a result, it's a little bit not quite as tall, shall we say, and you step in just a little bit lower. So it's got a great overall design. The original plan was to have 3 different bodies on this. They were going to have this, kind of the classic coupe style. I believe they were going to have a 4-door, and then they were also going to have a convertible. And in fact, you remember the Ford Skyliner, the hardtop retractable? That was originally developed to be a part of this line. But they quickly realized they weren't going to be making enough of them to make enough money off that concept. So they decided to shelve the idea because it was too expensive to put on this car and moved it over to Ford. So they had the Ford retractable. So once again, the 1956 Continental Mark II, modern formal, very elegant and very expensive. By the way, there's one thing that you don't see on this car that we have here in the museum. This car was not a factory air conditioning car. If it was, right here, you'd have a little cutout with an air inlet going in. Because this has this straight line right here, that means that was not an original air conditioning car. Air conditioning, of course, the only option that was available on a Continental Mark II. Stepping inside our Continental Mark II, you're going to find something different than what you were going to get in all of the other American cars that were being built back in the 1950s. Kind of remember back then, bling was the thing. I mean, 3-tone colors inside. That was becoming the rage with even some glittery kind of fabrics. But remember, this was all about formal elegance. That's exactly what they wanted. A lot of leather was used, but that wasn't the only option. And also plenty of power. Now, there weren't any newfangled things going on inside the interior of this car necessarily. It was more the execution, the way it was done. If you looked at this compared to a Lincoln Premier or a Lincoln Capri, the dash layout was very different. To start with, you had a 4-spoke steering wheel. With this Continental Mark II, it's just 3 spokes. But significantly, in the Lincoln, you had a horizontal speedometer. Here, we've got this great gauge cluster with these 4 gauges mounted directly above the steering wheel. Plenty of instrumentation and information that you could get up above. And I really love this Jet Age styling. Okay, there's a little bit of Jet Age styling in here with the climate control system that you could get right there. Now, I will point out, as I mentioned in the walkaround, there was only one option available for this car, and that was air conditioning. It cost $600, and it was mounted in the trunk. It was completely different than the way it was set up in most other cars. Instead of having a unit that was down here, it also had these vents that were integrated into the side in the interior. So they were stepping everything up just a bit. Decent room in the back seat. Remember, they were talking about having 3 different designs. One of the things we have here at the museum is this great book that shows a lot of the color options that were available. To start off with, you can see the different colors on the outside. These are the different subdued colors, is the way they used to talk about it back then on the outside. And look what you had available inside. Plenty of color combinations, so you could customize this car as much as you wanted. This was for all leather. You also could do leather and nylon. You could do leather and other material trim schemes. So various ways you could make this your own, because once again, you were spending an awful lot of money for this. Why not make it as customizable as you could possibly do? Of course, the elegance all over the place, especially I love in the door panels right here. This little setup that they've got, very subtle, the way you handle the door handle. Of course, there's no tacky window cranks. It's all power windows. Now, you got to remember, power windows weren't new. I think Packard was the first to introduce them, and Lincoln followed almost immediately afterwards. But by 1956, the idea of having power windows was still pretty rare, so it was a kind of elegance that you were going to expect if you were going to be buying this car. I love the padded dash, which once again for the mid-1950s was very rare and unusual. So it was an elegant location to sit and drive. Once again, it had enough power, 285 horsepower, and more importantly, it really had that prestige elegance. This was designed not to be a luxury car, it was designed to be a prestige car for those celebrities, for those people with lots of money that definitely wanted something more. Under the hood of our Continental Mark II, we find a 368 cubic inch V8 engine. But despite the exclusivity of the car, the engine itself really wasn't unique to the Continental division. This evolved as the Lincoln version of Ford's Y-block V8, an engine architecture that was used across many Ford Motor Company products during the 1950s. Unlike the smaller Y-blocks used in Ford and Mercury models, the Lincoln 368 had a larger bore and a larger stroke, and it produced 285 horsepower. And it also emphasized torque. It needed that to move the Mark II's substantial weight. Had an overhead valve design, of course, with deep skirt block for that added rigidity. And it represented a shift from Ford's earlier flathead engines when they brought it out. But while it had the same basic design, this engine is different. Engines used for the Mark IIs were built with tighter control for quality and tuned for smooth, quiet operation rather than pure performance. Of course, it's got those great Continental valve covers. Many of the Y-blocks were known for oiling challenges, especially at the top end of the motor. The result was a loud ticking or clattering noise, and that would not have been acceptable for a car like this. Now, fortunately, by 1956, revisions had been made to the oil delivery, which made this engine a logical choice for even discerning buyers. Of course, it just had a 3-speed automatic transmission, but it was all about refinement in driving. Now, you could say that putting this engine in the Continental Mark II was a bit of a compromise, right? They were already way over budget, and a new engine, well, that would have sent the cost of this thing to the moon. But a new engine would have also had unknowns as well. So using this Y-block was the perfect way to blend established performance with this beautiful exterior styling of the Mark II. How did Cadillac respond? Well, here at the Martin Auto Museum, we just happen to have their answer. In this case, it's a 1957 Cadillac Eldorado Brougham. And if you thought that Continental was expensive in 1956 at $10,000, well, when this car came out in 1957, it was $13,000. Boy, did it ratchet that up. And obviously a lot of styling differences between this and that Continental Mark II. That's much more subtle. This, well, there's still plenty of chrome, still has the big fins, and of course, look at this hardtop with this brushed aluminum. It's also a 4-door with a very small door in the back. And whereas the Continental was content to simply be elegant, this had more technological advances, shall we say. But it was crazy expensive, and as a result, they only sold about 700 of these during the 2-year run. In 1956, they sold just under 3,000 Mark IIs, but in 1957, that number dropped massively. There were less than 450 built. Part of the reason is that Ford was getting ready to introduce its exciting new model, the Edsel, and it needed production space. The bigger problem was that even with its $10,000 price tag, Ford was still losing money on every car, supposedly about $1,000. But then maybe this car wasn't about pure profits. It was a statement, both for the buyers and for Ford. Either way, in 1957, Ford made a decision to close the Continental division. The Mark II had, well, proved a point. Ford could build a top-tier luxury car. But why? I mean, after all, was it potentially taking away from other things happening within Ford? Without a higher production volume or a different cost structure, which were both not likely to happen, there just didn't seem to be a reason to continue. But while the Continental division closed, that name, of course, did live on, and there were plenty of marks as well appearing over the years. And the concept of understated elegance returned to Lincoln in 1961 with that spectacular Elwood angle design that lived on through the 60s and is so popular today. But for a time, this Continental Mark II reigned supreme, showing Ford could build something both expensive and beautiful.